Hello to those of you on Zoom too. So I'm Elaine and I'm here to give the opening remarks, and I'll hand the time over to Mo after that. So please bear with me while I go through some of these key opening remarks. So I've given my welcomes, and I think I'd like to introduce you slightly to FASS if you're not from FASS or NUS. So FASS was founded in 1929. I'm the Vice Dean of Research, by the way, which is why I'm giving this spiel about FASS. It's one of the largest faculties in the National University of Singapore. It encompasses 16 departments and offers a wide range of academic subjects in the humanities, social science, Asian studies, and language studies. And in particular, we're advancing research in areas related to the study of Asia as evidence in the topic of today's book talk. Among our many areas of research excellence, we have strengths in research on population and demography, families, aging, health, and cities. We currently, I don't think we have slides on these, do we? The research clusters? Nope. Hang on, let me just check. Okay, not yet. Okay, so we also have research clusters in gender and sexuality, language and linguistics, and the Belt and Road Network. In addition to that, we have research centers on family and population, social sciences and aging. We also feature a Brownback seminar series, which Elliot is running currently. That's right. Yes, amongst the many other things he does at the faculty. And it features talks by FASS academics every 2 weeks during term time. And last but not least, there's also the Singapore Research Nexus, which features events on Singapore studies every semester. The Singapore Research Nexus also has an online repository filled with Singapore-focused academic and creative projects. So that's my spiel on FASS in general. To also highlight, other than today's event, we have some upcoming events to share with you. Oops, what have I done? Sorry. Yokchuan? Maybe better if you control it. Okay, so we do have a talk coming up organized by the FASS Language and Linguistics Research Cluster. The details are there, as well as registration information. Another cluster is organizing a workshop on gender, youth, and media later in February. In March, there is a talk by a visiting professor from the University of Queensland, Gerard Hofstadter. I hope I haven't butchered his name. And that happens on 8th of March. Subsequent to that, in April and 17, FASS will be featuring some events tied to the SSRC Ideas Fest. So I don't think it has been publicized yet, but the Singapore Research Council, Singapore Social Science Research Council, SSRC, is holding a series of events across different academic institutions between March and April. So FASS will be featuring 2 of these events, and details are on the slide as well. So now we zoom to the here and now, okay, which is why many of you are here. So I'm pleased to be part of Assistant Professor Elliot Press-Freeman's book launch of Rights Refused, Grassroots Activism and State Violence in Myanmar, published by Stanford University Press. Elliot's book, which I had the chance to read beforehand, presents a nuanced ethnographic investigation of political and societal conditions in Myanmar to elicit the nuances of what he refers to as resistance and refusal towards the exercise of coercive and subtle forms of power by the state to regulate the behavior of people, or what academics more commonly term as biopolitics. I hope I got that right. Okay, Rights Refused received assistance, now I have to do a bit of publicity, in its path to publication from the FASS-RE, Asia Research Institute, Book Manuscript Workshop scheme, which Elliot, I'm not sure if he remembers doing this interview, remarked, it served as a commitment device to get a draft done and provided insights into your book that you might not have seen, getting you excited to finish the thing. So I'm not sure if you remember saying these, but we can trace it, yes. So on that note, I just want to congratulate Elliot once more, and I'm so glad so many of you are here to celebrate his book with him. And I would like to introduce the chair, Dr. Mo Thuza. Mo Thuza is a senior fellow, okay, where she coordinates its Myanmar Studies program. Mo joined ICS in 2008 as lead researcher in the ASEAN Studies Center up to August 2019. Prior to joining ICS, Mo spent 10 years at the ASEAN Secretariat, where she headed the Human Development Unit from 2004 to 2007. A former diplomat, she researched Burma's foreign policy implementation for her PhD at the National University of Singapore. Her research interests include ASEAN integration impacts and issues, Myanmar foreign policy, and ASEAN's dialogue relations. So I had a brief chat with Mo before, coming up here, and she said she feels underqualified. And I said, you are more than qualified, to serve as chair as well as discussant, because Mo has such deep personal knowledge, of happenings in Myanmar. And I have to say, with my own research in Myanmar many years ago, Mo was the one who started me on it, helping me to get access to Myanmar. So on that note, I think I would like to hand the mic over to Mo.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Elaine. Very good evening to everyone seated in the room and those of the participants joining via Zoom. As Elaine has kindly introduced, my name is Mo. And yes, I was just kind of like confessing to Elaine that I felt a little bit like a fish out of water, because with that policy background, with my aspirations to be a historian, sometimes, one might wonder, what is this woman doing introducing Dr. Elliot Prass Freeman's book, which actually really looks at a very different community or communities in Myanmar engaging and navigating the policy space. That policy space of maybe myself at a very tangential level maybe has been culpable in, creating and scoping and so on. Although I'm happy to admit, report, confess that I've long left that policy space for more than 2 decades. In Burmese, there's a certain word called wa. Those of you who have studied Burmese, who are following Myanmar studies, Burma studies, may be familiar with it. And wa, if you look at the interpretation, it means seniority. So Eliot is one such person who has that wa for me. Eliot is my senior in academia, in research, and I think my interest and I think my growing and deepening commitment to really making contributing to the field of Burma studies, Myanmar studies, really comes from knowing about what Eliot has been doing, what Eliot's work has been. So when someone who is your senior in academia and research asks you to do something, you don't say no. That's why I'm doing the I'm doing this introduction, as well as serving as a discussant and helping moderate the session later on. But the star really is the book that we are here to hear more insights from today. And the title itself, of course, is very arresting. It really captures your interest and attention, particularly in the current context of what's going on in Myanmar since the military seized power almost 3 years ago on the 1st of February 2021. So, since then, of course, I think what we see and hear in the news is very much this continuing bleak scenario, spiraling chaos and conflict. And I think the images that all of us who have been following the situation, the developments, the tragedy, all the atrocities that have been committed, we see this, we are horrified. And yet, I think all of us also, we who are outside Myanmar share not only that sense of horror, but, I think that the feelings of, I think, empathy, sympathy, solidarity, if you will, with the people in Myanmar, the communities who are caught in the crosshairs, who don't seem to have any access to redress or to even, even though maybe they're shouting at the tops of their lungs to get their voices heard beyond what they are doing in the streets, covertly, overtly, or increasingly taking up arms and pushing back with armed resistance in various forms. So what we see and hear in the news, what we hear analysts say and comment, and I think both Stephen, Eliot, myself, we've also been asked to give comments and analyses. I think there's always going to be that kind of a gap, or a difficulty, if you will, a challenge in grasping or understanding the complexities of the coup, the resistance to it, the dynamics within that resistance, the different motivations and very dedicated, committed sentiments of the people who are participating in different ways, in different parts, different aspects in the resistance, who are stakeholders in this whole movement that has sprung up very organically, and that's been sustained all these years, 3 years, and that's a record because I think it's never been seen before. And I think, there's also that part of, I think, celebrating the creativity and commitment of the Generation Z, Gen Z, as we call it. And it's also a very unique moment for Myanmar where it's kind of like a leaderless movement, where I think, and this is probably also one of the difficulties that most of us used to hearing about analyses, used to analyzing, reading about previous authoritarian repressive situations in Myanmar and how people have pushed back against it. We all look at who is the unifying figure. Even now, we may be asked questions, who is the unifying figure that can somehow, lead Myanmar into another political future? So we get these questions. And of course, the comparative situations across the globe, I think people tend to fall into this. And I think those are the kinds of questions that, well, we'll hear Elliot talk more about this, why it's different, and how I think the sentiments in Myanmar among the people whose voices that many people purport to speak for, to represent, sometimes I think needs to have that different, more detailed interpretation and amplification, which Eliot's book does. So I'm already kind of like giving a kind of promotion on why you should buy the book and why you should read it. And actually, if you read it, it's kind of like unputdownable. Or maybe I'm biased. But anyway, so that's the kind of context and what was going through my mind when I picked up the book and I couldn't put it down. But of course, ultimately I had to put it down because there are work commitments that I have to do. But it's that kind of book. And as I was mentioning, the author, Eliot, is someone I've known, I think, for the past 10 years, right, Eliot? Yes, you're an anthropologist, I'm an aspiring historian, but I think our research interests have overlapped. I think we share the same concerns about what's going on with regard to, I think, communities being denied rights, and sometimes those denial of rights actually being justified in the sake of so-called the greater good. I think these concerns, the concerns over dissonances that we see, and the interactions that we've had with different communities on the ground, engaging what I think to many people in Myanmar were momentous changes during that brief past decade of opening or transition, as we call it. Thing is, it was in that context that our research interests and the areas that we were interested in also overlapped and found, I think, a mutual meeting of minds and so on. And I think also Eliot was very fortunate to have been among the researchers who got that opportunity to conduct extensive fieldwork. Now, anthropologists do ethnography, and Myanmar is the kind of country that you really need to do it in a very in-depth, focused kind of way. And I think prior to 2014, researchers, particularly people, anthropologists, ethnographers, weren't really given that kind of opportunity. The only other researcher I can think of, and she wasn't an anthropologist, Dr. Mary Callahan, Professor Mary Callahan, she got access to the military archives because she said she was writing about the military, but that was one thing. So I think it's that kind of, rare opportunity given to researchers very interested in understanding why and how Myanmar is changing, how communities are dealing with it, navigating these changes. I think with that core, maybe the core sentiments that developed during a previous decades of repression, living under that repression, living in silence, to borrow another Myanmar expert's words on it. So I think, this is all the more reason why I think Eliot's book is so valuable, because it is based on his fieldwork from that decade. But what is unique about it also is that he juxtaposes that with the current moment. And so understanding why the situation, why things are the way they are right now really is grounded in the work that Eliot managed to do. Details of his qualifications are in the program, so I'm not going to read them out, but I just wanted to just add these additional points for introducing Eliot. And even though, you know, several of us who want to continue doing research, who need to continue doing research and talk to people in Myanmar are not given the opportunity, the acquaint, we'll talk more about these terms later on in the discussion, but who haven't had that opportunity or the chance to go to Myanmar. Nevertheless, Eliot is among those who have consistently kept up monitoring, kept up conversations with people involved in it, and try to really continue understanding what makes the refusal of something imposed on them, something that people are told is good for them, why that refusal continues in various forms. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, participants online, it's my pleasure to introduce the author of Rights Reviews, Dr. Eliot Prasad-Freeman, who will give you more insights into the book for which we are gathered here today.
Thank you all for coming and for the really gracious and lovely introductions from both Elaine and Dr. Mo. It's a nice opportunity to do my own set of thank yous because there's so many people in this room who helped make this book, as humble as it is, possible. Not least of which my lovely wife, Andrea Lee, who, when we got married 10 years ago, pledged to read everything that I ever wrote. And I can tell you, I think without exception, she's violated that vow every day of her life. But now she has a chance in one discreet and very affordable book to do so. But also, Elaine mentioned the book workshop that I had, and Andrew Ong, who's here in the room, and Stephen Campbell, amongst others, participated in it. And it happened right after the coup. And I turned the book in to them 2 months prior. So the coup kind of severed this book progress coming to fruition. And suddenly as I think one of the members put it, I went from doing anthropology to history. If I hadn't dealt with the coup as this emergent and kind of world historical thing that had happened. And so that workshop gave me a chance to reflect on the book and on the coup. And the book, as a result, is an attempt to try to make the coup legible through the social activities that I was lucky enough, as Dr. Mo points out, to trace during that period of transition, and then use the coup to reflect upon the sort of stories of the so-called transition that got elided or got obscured by the more breathless accounts of how, you know, Burma was now attached to the globe again, and it has no longer cut off, and it was about to take off. But then a genocide happened, and then a coup, and so the book is trying to make sense of those different conditions. So because I want to leave some of the book to you to explore on your own, I'm sure when you get home tonight and read it, I'm not going to go too far into depth, because what the book tries to do is, or what I was lucky enough to do through this work with these activists, is go on a sort of movable feast throughout the country. And so the book does touch on a lot of different domains, but I am going to, you know, march you through the slides here for 20 minutes to give you an outline of some of the things I'm talking about. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the activist challenge in a place such as Myanmar. I'm going to look at the particular tactics and strategies they pursue. And then I'm going to talk about the political idioms and concepts that mobilize people, looking at that term "acquaint" that Dr. Mo mentioned. And then I'm going to talk about the sort of double refusal of activists of the sort of despotism of the Myanmar's regime, but also a refusal of sort of the rights regimes that flow from global liberalism that presume to address all the problems. And a little bit of background of the book, that while I was lucky enough to get there in 2014 when things were opening up, I first went to Myanmar much earlier, back in 2004. And at that time, after having read many of the accounts of living in silence or karaoke fascism, I kind of expected big men with guns everywhere to maybe even train those guns on me. And so going through immigration was rather terrifying, not in the sense that I really thought anything bad would happen to me bodily, but I had come all this way. I didn't want to immediately get deported. But then I only faced pleasant or disinterested officials, some of whom laughed at my attempts to speak Burmese. And so throughout that year that I spent there, I often wondered, where was this sort of scary state that I had read so much about? And I knew that it was there. I'm not trying to deny it, but the sort of temporality and the spatiality of that state was not what I had expected at all. But of course, this is a state that orchestrates a military coup. And so part of the book is to try to explain this broader apparatus of power that operates in the daily lives of Burmese people, sometimes through despotic force and sometimes through absence. And so I talk about how it is sometimes overly present and sometimes not at all. So the radical presence point is pretty obvious in keeping with what we know about an authoritarian state. Particularly during this moment of transition, you saw, although things were supposed to be improving, what we could call neoliberal reterritorialization, which is probably an overly fancy way of saying land grabs that were enabled by land going onto the market as a commodity as opposed to a means of production. The sovereign exception in the form of a coup, and racial differentiation up to and including genocide. So some of the most sovereign kind of things imaginable. But this is also the kind of state, and as I followed these activists around, would not respond to farmers' complaint letters, would tell protesters to finish up a plow protest quickly so as to not make a scene. It will not rearrest a protester like Do San San here when she takes off her shirt and burns it in a court compound. Not something I expected to witness in an authoritarian state. I kept waiting for the riot police to arrive, and instead the police just calmed her down and gently ushered her to the side. And this isn't just what we might call the coercive arm of the state, but also the sort of governmental or biopolitical apparatus, in which is the kind of state that would have administrative forms, but not use them, have ethnic classifications, the famous 135 Danyinta, but not really know them, would have ID cards, but not insist that anyone carry them. So the first census in a really long time was held in 2014 and found that most people, not most, but a huge number, 30 to 40% of people didn't actually have these cards. And more importantly, the things that these cards asked, what race are you, Balumyole, is a kind of question that a Burmese person could respond to with a number of different answers that we wouldn't really think of as a race. So something like Botabata Lumyo, which means Buddhist Lumyo. And as an anthropologist, I'm completely fine with that answer. I don't need people to respond with a race, but it shows that the state didn't have this sort of monopoly on even categorization. And as a result, people, much like Edmund Leach had written about 60 years before, were still able to maneuver to improve their position within this broader scheme. And finally, it will give over certain localized state functions to right-wing political religious organizations such as Mabata. So if we put these together, we have a kind of state that conducts genocide and stage a coup d'etat, some of the most sovereign acts imaginable, but also sort of disappear from grasp. This means that it requires a particular kind of engagement. And so much of the book is trying to theorize that form of engagement. So obviously, when the coup happened, Burmese people were not impressed. And I argue in the book that the massive revolution raging today would be kind of impossible to grasp or understand without the mobilization during the 2010s that planted these seeds of repertoires of contention that were then used during the revolution. This is also very self-serving because it makes my book seem a lot more important than it necessarily is. So the activists that I study in the book, I argue, must mimic the state's own kind of movement between or oscillation between presence and absence. So activists must never be completely absent, either as abandonment of space, so they can't flee, or as subjective quietude. And I'll come back next slide to what I mean by that. But obviously they cannot assert presence in that sort of like macho, let's go to the street and have a protest, as that can prove suicidal against sovereign power. So what do I mean by subjective quietude? So the idea here is that there's a sort of idea that as long as I'm keeping resistance or refusal to something bad in my heart, that's as much as can be asked for. But the problem here is that the distance can't be so vast that the subject sort of vanishes away. It no longer troubles that which it's supposedly resisting. It becomes sort of undifferentiable from pacification if you're not, semiotically speaking, there's the little triangle up there, creating signs that other people can interpret as you actually resisting or refusing. So if you do, it sends signs to others that are more likely to be read as acquiescence and pacification. And as a result, this sort of preemption of solidarity becomes self-devouring of a movement. And so the calibration necessary for an activist is very subtle. They have to, and also across space and time, where they need to presence the state, get it to appear, and then flee before it destroys them. So, and here's Stephen Campbell's favorite meme that I made. There's definitely a dialectic here in the sense that resistance is that sort of moments of direct contestation in order to presence the state, provide a model for other people to see an alternative articulated. And the argument isn't here that normal Burmese people are victims of false consciousness or hoodwinked, but they have been conditioned to view their reality as their reality. And part of activism is getting to get people to see normalized conditions as political choices and hence things that could be done otherwise. Then refusal is then a lot of the other work of navigating the administrative state, enduring, mobilizing, waiting, rehabilitating, planning, and evading, apparently, that happens in the shadow of direct contestation. And this is where the action in the book actually is, because while it does feature protests and people burning their shirts and moments in the coup, a lot of the ethnography was tracking the daily lives of what these activists did, a lot of which was supporting the sort of survival, the day-to-day survival of people who had been abandoned. And then that sort of work slowly organized and mobilized these communities into imagining things differently. And then I use some more perhaps obnoxious theoretical terminology to describe exactly what that is in the book. Okay, so what exactly do these activists do? So the background of my studies methods, I was lucky enough to work with this group here, the Movement for Democracy Current Forces, and also another group called the Community Development Initiative. The first time I met one of their leaders, a very prominent character in the book, Oto, I was trying to make sense of this word force. Like, are you a political party? Are you an NGO? I was trying to like make this legible. And he said quite dryly, we are a force. I laughed, and luckily so did he eventually. But it revealed that he didn't want to be, his group didn't want to be sort of siloed into the kind of organizational structures of log frames and political parties that were taking over Burma at that time. They felt that there needed to be something outside of the transition to make sure that if things went wrong, and they did, that there would be an alternative, and also to keep putting pressure on the state to live up to its commitments. Well, the commitments it wanted it to make. So the group was like, quite like Don Juan once said, that to be loyal to one paramour is to betray all the others, to be unfaithful to the rest. They were like that, but for activism. They felt like to only choose one struggle in a country that had so many problems was to leave other people left alone. And so they were really ecumenical about their defense of the marginalized. And so they went from rural struggles, particularly in Sagaing and Mandalay, where most of the revolution is raging today, to industrial zones outside of Yangon. And they were based in the peri-urban areas of Yangon where daily life itself was a struggle. So I got to see, as I said earlier, a sort of movable feast of all the challenges that were occurring in lowland Burma. I want to just quick aside that this is not really a study that deals with the upland issues, and that's a different book that's going to be written by someone who knows that much better than I do. So this is like the lowland area of the Burma majority, with a focus also on the Rohingya genocide that happened in the meantime. Okay, so as activists, they kind of embodied a social type that is relatively legible in Myanmar, the same way I could ask my children what they wanted to be grow up and what they wanted to be when they grew up, and they said a doctor or, you know, baker or whatever. A Burmese person might say they wanted to be an activist. But because going to prison is so important and such a big part of demonstrating that you've done your time, that you're understand the sacrifices that attend being an activist, people get thrown out of life cycles. And so as a result, they can't really come back to being a doctor and a baker because they just spent the last 15 years in prison. But they do learn a set of pretty unique skills that gives them the ability to mobilize communities. How do they support themselves? They have to forge relationships with the ones they are defending that they stress are non-transactional. They don't want to take money from the people that they're defending. Otherwise, they become kind of no more than a puesa, a sort of broker. But then as a result, they have to get their money from someplace. And so part of the activist challenge was a constant hustle to get enough money to support their activities. So what did they do? They have to be willing to protest, to be arrested, to be beaten, to go to prison. Some pretty macho things there. And they use their bodies rather than the rights of an unmarked citizen to ground their incursions. And what I mean by this is that rather than we might be able to point to our standing as a sort of third person, I am a member of the Singaporean polity, I have rights as such, they couldn't do that. They would get laughed at if they said, well, I'm a Burmese person, I'm a citizen, so allow me to do this. They have to kind of point to their own physical bodies sometimes, the way that they hold their bodies and they encounter and incur against the officials that are trying to prevent them from doing what they want. But also sometimes they'll literally point to their scars and they'll say, look at this. I got this when I was in prison before you were born. There's nothing that you can do to me that hasn't been done before. And I would, the hair would stand up on the back of my head when I heard that kind of stuff, because it's a kind of courage that I certainly don't have. But on the other hand, while that does seem quite macho, and they do threaten and intimidate, they also bargain, cajole, tease, and beg, showing a broad range of improvisational tactics that one has to pursue when you don't have rights to rely on. They often will use the esoteric realm to intimidate and shame. So here is a group of peasants in Lepadown in central Burma who are dressed up as the ancestors of the land that was stolen by the Chinese-backed military-owned conglomerate. And they're challenged basically in a system where the law was not on their side. They sort of evoked an alternative realm of justice. They said, well, we can't go to the courts for this, but if we curse you, and the curse was a sort of evocation of an alternative justice that said, judge whoever is the rightful owner, and the person who's lying goes to hell for 500 lifetimes, was a way of kind of stepping outside of that realm of secular domination. You can steal the land, but you can never remove the curse. And the demonstration of the efficacy of some of these things was the fact that the owners of the companies would say, please take the curse off. This is really ruining my home life, and my family doesn't want to talk to me anymore. Finally, activists must try to make the state legible, demanding responses. Even as they do so, they try that sort of horizontal move I spoke about earlier, articulate their demand to observing public. So note how much text is here to explain who this group is and what they're up to. Also, this is a sort of one of those cursing rituals in which they evoke the ogre of the land to come attack those who had stolen it. And I was very curious about the sort of cosmology of this. And I asked them, where did you find these pictures of these ogres? And they said, we just Googled ogre. And these are the scariest ogres we could find. And so it demonstrates a sort of flexibility of tactics using whatever is at hand. Okay, finally, how then to mobilize the people in this weird sort of milieu? And then I'll shut up. So this is where I talk about the sort of play on words in the title. The way rights themselves are obviously denied to people, but they're also sort of refused as paradigms that can lead to liberation. So this is Goto, who says, whoops. He says, the first time I go to a new place and meet the villagers, I cannot say, you will have to protect your rights. If I talk that way, they'll drive me off. Who is this guy? They will say. And this is a little bit surprising to hear, given the way that Myanmar has been so fully kind of absorbed, at least before the Rohingya genocide, into the sort of human rights regime. After the Berlin Wall falls and we reached Fukuyama's end of history, human rights became sort of that thing that everyone was paying attention to, including rock star Bono here and with Aung San Suu Kyi's cutout face. And this is also something you often heard a lot from dissidents, people who had fled the regime, especially after 1988, and gone to this border town called Mesat and other places. They asked for weapons to fight the regime. The Western countries said, no, but we'll give you human rights trainings. And so as a result, there's a sort of political economy of aid that led to people endorsing human rights. But on the other hand, when I went inside the country, there wasn't any talk about rights, human or otherwise. So at first, I was thinking, like those instead, people would say we're working for revolution or for the daily lives of the people. So this is the very start of my PhD research. Why such a difference? Why so much talk of human rights outside of Burma and so little in the place where they're occurring? First glance, it's kind of obvious answer. Like if you are going to endorse rights in a place that doesn't allow you to speak them, you're going to get bonked on the head. The place outside, you can speak about them freely. But this is a sort of endorsement for ethnography. I spent enough time with the people on the border who said these really bizarre things about how rights had changed their life, how they had started to see themselves as full people that they hadn't seen before. I was like, okay, that's kind of strange. And so I started to zero in on rights themselves. And one person in Yangon, who's the head of an NGO, said, well, you have to understand, we don't have rights in our culture. She says, if you're invited to go to a training or something, you'll use a kuenye. You will say you have a right to go to that training. I think in the West, you would say opportunity, no? But this is because the separate Western concept of right does not exist in our culture. It has been used a lot in the exile groups, so people have heard it, but the people don't have the concept, and the average people see human rights as a political word. They don't want to really study about it. Now, at this point, I was a junior anthropology student. I was very concerned about the dangers of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is that if you don't have a word in your language, it means you don't have that in your culture. And it was used to do linguistic racism for a long time by colonists who said, you guys deserve to be colonized because you don't have the right words. So I didn't want to jump right to that conclusion. Didn't want to jump to that conclusion at all. But I did think it might be interesting to explore what it would mean for a right and an opportunity to be indistinguishable. These things that my particular political and sociolinguistic community keeps separated aren't actually cleaved apart, that you can only have a right if you have the opportunity to realize it. And so I started to check this out by developing what's called a corpus of looking at all the ways people are talking about akwinye and cognates like yapanquint and akwintlan. And it turns out akwinye is indeed translated as rights or opportunities depending on the context. So if you have lu akwinye, human rights, lotama akwinye, worker rights, it means kind of rights. But if you have akwinye tama with the suffix, person who does stuff suffix, it means opportunist. So it clearly points in two different directions. So I was thinking this is strange, and it made me ask, well, do we even know what a right is in general? And these things are notoriously difficult to define, especially because they tend to be used unreflectively. Everyone knows what a right is. Both in casual and technical use can mean aspirations. It would be right that, or it would be a right that. It could be moral demands. It's right because it should be. They could be just desserts. It's been earned through some sort of labor. I earn the right to do that. It could be the most easy one, the quasi-legal statutes. It's right because law says so. And note here this interesting slippage between adjective and nominal use that we have in English, which we don't have in Burmese. You can say it is a right and it is right. They both use the same root. But in Burmese, the root for quint is more like permission. And as a result, it has no normative value associated with it. So I got interested in thinking about what a right might be and whether there are different versions of rights. So this philosopher, Raymond Goyce, who I'm a big fan of, is interested in the structure of the demand, how it works. And he says the rights are rights because they act as trumps over political imperatives. They act as a sort of firewall or bulwark against certain incursions. They act to sever or foreclose politics, defined as like discursive or literal battles over normative ideals and distributive resources. Basically, like to put it more simply, like I might think it's a good idea to round up all the billionaires and do terrible things to them. But under a rights paradigm where we feel like you can't do that, that gets taken off the table politically, for better or for worse. Now, Goyce thinks this is not just bad, but actually rarely describes how things called rights work in practice. But others, like Ronald Dworkin, a famous liberal rights theorist, think they're good, and he wants us to take rights seriously. So essentially, the last couple minutes has all been to set up this very bad joke, which is that in Burma, they don't take rights seriously. They take rights seriously, in the sense that, that you can laugh. It's pretty good. Because rights are nominalized in a particular kind of way that they can be stolen, they can be snatched, they can be run off. People can run off with them. So here in one of the cartoons, many of which I feature in the book, we have the guy of the right who says, I'm not the kind of person who takes everything. And he's carrying a bag of akwinye. I've left something for you. And he leaves the duties behind. So what I want to focus on here is how rights are understood not as they are in the liberal tradition as inalienable possessions. A right in the way we talk about them in English tends to be the same way we talk about mothers or arms. So if I'm on the way to this talk and I get my arm severed, I still say I lost my arm, even if it's not really mine anymore, it's on the pavement. And if my mother perishes, even though she's still doing quite well, thank you, she's still my mother, even though she doesn't really exist. Rights are kind of the same sort of thing in the sense that as those philosophers in the 1990s, the Beastie Boys remind us, you have to fight for your right to party. So we have to fight for things that are rights, even if we don't actually possess them, which is kind of a strange thing I want to highlight. So this guy, one of my teachers, Paul Kalkman, talks about inalienable possessions as those things that are presupposed, the woman who has a head versus the woman's head. We save the time. We get right onto it in language because we don't need to describe a woman having a head because we know that women tend to. And they're constantly discussed. If the woman's head is on fire, we need to know about it. So there's a recursive relationship in inalienable possessions about the things that we talk about a lot end up getting embedded in our conception of ourselves as people. And then you can apply this to the Western context where you said the woman who had rights is going to sound strange, but the woman who is fighting for her rights is totally normal, even though it's a little bit bizarre if you think about it. So there is this strange relationship of possession that I started to find everywhere in Western philosophical texts that presupposed a relationship that I didn't think really should have been presupposed, but more importantly, I didn't think Burmese people felt that way when they were thinking about rights. So here's Jacques Rancière, clearly surprised at my critique, looking at all the times that he uses the things you have when you don't actually have them. Now, I don't want to be too hard on Rancière. I'm pretty sure he can take it. But what he's doing is highlighting something cool, the performativity of something like rights, the sort of fake it till you make it, invoke it until it becomes real. And that can happen. You can perform rights into existence that didn't exist before. But I want to highlight that if you take that perspective, you have to also acknowledge the movement in the other direction. You can lose rights just as easily. And if you remain within an alienable rights tradition, it's hard to have the vocabulary to describe that loss. So in America, we just lost the right to abortion. People will still describe it that way. When you lose a right that's so fundamental to yourself, it feels like a huge loss. Okay, so in Burma, because relations between Burmese people and governance apparatuses never sort of stabilized into contractual forms describing standards of care, to which subalterns, Andrew in the back, that's for you, have legible and predictable entitlements, something called rights. Rights remain alienable possessions. They can be carried off, they can be stolen, they can be like snatched. One person can get more rights than another. And in contrast to rights in the West, imagine as a kind of public good, right? My, like clean air and national defense, Stephen getting those things doesn't affect my use, but rights aren't really thought about in that way in Burma, where in Burma, we usually consider that if you obtain your rights, I will lose mine, or I win and you lose. And they're only accessible to those who perform them adequately. They emerge only if there's an opportunity for their realization. Okay, I'm gonna wrap up pretty soon, I swear. So given this context, something like acquitté, which can kind of point in two different directions, rights or opportunities, tends to be interpreted more as an opportunity than as a right. I love this particular cartoon because it models the semiotic process of realizing that something means one thing and not the other in sort of the real time of the cartoon. You have students on the top being taught what acquitté, human rights means. And the teacher says, let's say it 3 times. No, every person has the right to security from harm. And then because this is Burma, bullets come shooting through the the classroom, and she yells, the bullets are coming, crouch under the bench. So then she tries to go back to the same status, but the students, being smart semiotic subjects, have already updated their priors. They realize this is not a world where you can get human rights. And so when she says, all right, say it again 3 times, they say human rights means crouch under the bench, crouch under the bench. So one of the things I want to stress here is that if you are told you have rights, but those rights are not realized or enjoyed, how many times or in what kind of ways must that performative fail before you see that failure not as an exception or as a mistake, but as a reflection of reality itself? At what point does it congeal into just the way things are? How many times must a rule be broken before it breaks indelibly? Okay, so then we can return to this quotation and show that maybe it has some meaning and it's not racist linguistics to assume that rights doesn't mean the same thing there. All right, so then rights is refused 2 ways. Rights as substantive entitlements are certainly denied to Burmese, but Burmese people also refuse rights as an idiom for structuring claims. Activists reject them as potentially undermining their projects. Recall Koto saying he would get chased off. And marginalized people refuse them as a false promise that exposes them to risk. Okay. At one point, this crystallized in a pretty brutal way when a Myanmar Muslim activist said, if a beggar child demands something, you won't give it to him. But if he's cowering in the corner, you take pity on him. We are the most discriminated against minority in the country. We can't afford to be so aggressive about demanding things like rights. So people refuse rights because it exposes them to risk and danger that they wouldn't otherwise be subject to. They have to operate through different idioms. Okay, so are they completely unuseful? The coup does not contain the power of the trump. It's closer to a counterclaim against power. And we might understand rights in that always aspirational sense, made possible only by the opportunity to realize them. And so the activist political task becomes to create that opportunity, to create the conditions of possibility for something like a to be realized. Not a right to have rights, but maybe an opportunity to have opportunities. Okay, so I would normally do the anthropology thing, which is you go somewhere and you find something that seems strange, and you make it seem more legible. And you bring it back to America, where I'm from, and show that the rights that we think we have actually operate more like they do in Burma than they do there. But I don't have time for that because I want to give my discussants some time to say some things, and we can come back to that in, what's it called? Question and answer. But what I do want to do is finish with one last slide on what the activists are doing. I think that they are kind of like guides to alternative futures because they can't immediately enact new and inevitable ones. And that's kind of what the revolution is about. But their bodies and their words kind of initiate these sort of potential trajectories, ones that haunt the existing one and threaten to return later as a sort of ghost. The activists lay down different pathways that people could potentially take that can then be drawn upon as resources for current struggles. And that, I think, gives me some hope in the current moment of the revolution. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Elliot. I'm sure we can revisit some of those points, or you can elaborate some of those points that you skipped during the discussion as well as the Q&A. I think we have the discussion session, and I will abide by the advice of the organizers how we want to have the three discussants sitting up here facing the audience. Are we all supposed to have a seat? Right, okay. So we have the author, and may I invite and introduce at the same time Dr. Stephen Campbell.
You want us also?
Yes, and Stephen, my apologies, I should have introduced you earlier. Dr. Stephen Campbell is associate professor, also an anthropologist, and he's with the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Nanyang Technological University, and someone also who's very deeply invested in looking at maybe less voiced areas or less visible areas of the consequences of the 2021 coup. And I think one area that you're doing is labor migration and the situation of people in the Myanmar people in Thailand. So this is the panel. I'm also serving as one of the discussants as well as moderating. So I'll be switching hats quite a bit.
Yeah, and just a quick interjection. Because I had a chance to talk about my book, I also wanted to make it a little bit more focused on what's going on in Myanmar in general. And so lucky enough to have Stephen and Dr. Mo to talk about their own perspectives on the ongoing revolution. And so we can get a little bit less like, yay, it's the book, and more kind of like focused on, what's going on.
And call me Mo.
Okay.
As you usually do. I don't merit the doctorate. Yeah. So again, I'm supposed to be moderator and discussant, but I guess, at this point in time, we can be pretty informal about it. You've heard more than you need from me. I'll just interject later on, but we'd like to hear, I think, Stephen's take and comments and responses to Elliot's book. Over to you, Stephen.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me here and giving me the opportunity to speak about Elliot Plessy-Freeman's new book. So in case you have not yet read the book, it is fantastic. It is theoretically brilliant and ethnographically rich, and I'm not a gambler. However, it is I feel confident in saying that we can expect this book to receive one or more book prizes in the coming year. Now, I also feel confident in saying that decades from now, this book will be one of those ethnographies like Edmund Leach's Political Systems of Highland Burma, to which, for better or for worse, anthropologists and other scholars of Myanmar will feel compelled to continually revisit and to engage with. So this means that if anyone here has not yet read the book, you are at some point going to feel as though you really should, because everyone else around you, all the other students and scholars of Myanmar, but also anthropologists who may not be specifically interested in Myanmar, they are going to be talking. And so for that reason, you might as well get yourself a coffee after the presentation and get reading it, because the conversation is going to arise at some point. Another prediction I feel confident about. So with that said, at the most general level, this book is, as I see it, a contribution to resistance studies in the academic social sciences. Now, there's a clear debt in this book to the work of James Scott, who gave input, as Elliot mentioned, during a book workshop. He also contributed a very supportive blurb to the back cover of the book. However, the reason why the book is such an important contribution in terms of theory and analysis is that it manages to address and to go beyond some of the important critiques that were raised in the 1990s and early 2000s about academic resistance studies. So Rights Refused does this by advancing a dialectical interpretation of activist practice and subaltern struggle. So the book's interpretation is dialectical in the sense of analyzing social phenomena as open-ended relational processes rather than in terms of fixed identities and stable meanings. So this dialectical approach is explicit in some parts of the text, but it's also implicit throughout the book as a whole. So allow me to elaborate. So from the 1980s to the mid-1990s or thereabouts, there was a veritable industry of academic resistance studies. Now, James Scott's Weapons of the Weak is just the most famous example, but there was quite a lot. However, subsequent critiques of resistance studies pointed to certain conceptual shortcomings. So I'm thinking, among these critiques, I'm thinking, for example, of Timothy Mitchell's 1990 article, Everyday Metaphors of Power, Sherry Ortner's 1995 article, Resistance and the Problem of Ethnographic Refusal, and Saba Mahmood's 2005 book, Politics of Piety. So in various ways, these interventions critiqued the conceptual fetishism in resistance studies of the resisting subject, who was conceptually positioned outside of, autonomous of, and always already against centers of power. So the result of this conceptual fetishism was that resistance studies fell into a one-dimensional dichotomization of power versus resistance, as well as a reduction of agency to resistance. So how does Rights Refused fit into this debate? Well, Elliot takes from the resistance studies literature its kernel of truth, namely the ethnographic fact of struggle by subordinated individuals and groups, but he then incorporates into his analysis a recognition of ambiguity, oscillation, contradiction, and indeterminacy, which are critical aspects of any dialectical interpretation. And importantly, this ambiguity, oscillation, and indeterminacy are constituted in Rights Refused by the shifting social relations in which subjects in struggle are embedded and in which moments of encounter occur. So for example, Elliot writes that, quote, a focus on oscillation, movement, and flux destabilizes conceptions of social actors as monadic. Now, I really, really like that statement. I fully endorse it. Elsewhere in the book, Elliot explains along similar lines that, quote, close examination of actual encounters exposes ambiguity. In activist events in Myanmar, bodily arrangements display perpetual oscillation between transgressive defiance, resistance, and stoic denial, refusal. So what are the analytical implications of attending to relational oscillation, flux, and ambiguity in our interpretation of moments of struggle and of contentious encounters, such as those that fill the pages of Rights Refused? Well, one implication of an understanding such as this is that it's not until the end of history, or at least the end of a particular historical era, that we will be able to deliver anything like a conclusive interpretation of historical events and processes. Now, Hegel famously wrote that the owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of dusk. He meant that philosophy is only able to really understand a given historical process and its developmental logic at the very moment when it passes away. Another way to say this is that the meaning of any given historical event is not fixed once and for all. The ongoing cumulative process of history continually enables and in fact demands successive reinterpretation of past events. So let us return then to rights refused. So in the book, Eliot cautions us, the readers, against narrowly focusing in our social analysis on singular moments of direct contestation against authority. So those are his words. The reason why such a temporally narrow focus is problematic is because we as social analysts then fix our interpretation at a particular moment in time or to a past historical event. By doing so, we abandon the necessarily ongoing task of continually reinterpreting past events in light of and in relation to the unfolding course of history, which continually gives those past events new meanings. So Eliot is explicit about this in the book. The reason we must continually reinterpret past events in relation to the unfolding course of history is because, he writes, quote, the various historical chains of responses give an event its meaning. Now, the most fascinating illustration of this recursive interpretive process in Rights Refused is found in Eliot's analysis of cursing ceremonies directed against individuals in Myanmar who are deemed to be responsible for the theft of peasant land. So a supernatural curse of the sort that dispossessed peasants cast on large landowners or on complicit military or government figures, Eliot explains, these are temporally open-ended. So just because the target of a curse does not immediately suffer some harmful consequence does not mean that the curse can be said to have failed. It may simply be that the harm which the curse is meant to affect has yet to manifest. When, at some point in the future, a harm does befall the individual targeted by the curse, then the cursing ceremony can be then reinterpreted as having successfully delivered on its promise. Only then, when the curse's historical development has played out, will it be possible to offer something like a conclusive interpretation of the cursing ceremony. So in the book, Eliot takes this interpretive open-endedness even further. It's impossible to determine once and for all, he argues, whether any given act of resistance has resulted in victory or failure. So it's impossible, in the case of the curse, whose harm has yet to manifest, apparent failure, he writes, may simply be a passing state of affairs. However, another, even more radical consequence of this interpretive indeterminacy is that social phenomena can, again, in a very dialectical way, become their opposite as the manifold historical relations in which they are embedded transform. So seemingly devastating events and the bleakest of situations can transform into or can open up moments of radical emancipation. Now, Eliot conducted his ethnographic research for Rights Refused during the 10-year period of the so-called democratic transition, which ended with the military coup of February 2021. Now, the 10-year period of reform from 2011 to 2021 was especially celebrated by domestic elites, foreign corporations, and liberal pundits, both within the country and abroad. But as Eliot shows very effectively in the book, the so-called transition was also a moment in which civilian and military elites colluded in repressing worker, peasant, and student struggles. And it was during Myanmar's so-called democratic transition that, as Eliot mentioned earlier, the military carried out the Rohingya genocide, which elected civilian officials and government were complicit in defending. So it was during those years as well that Buddhist nationalists carried out anti-Muslim pogroms across the country. So, well, of course, the 2021 military coup needs to be roundly condemned, and along with the violence against civilians afterwards. And practical solidarity must be extended to the people of Myanmar in their ongoing struggle against the violent reassertion of direct military rule. Nevertheless, it's also imperative, I would insist, to retain a sober critique of the so-called democratic transition that unfolded over the preceding decade. And Eliot's book helps us retain this sober critique because of what it shows. Now, in light of Myanmar's recent history, what are the implications of the interpretive open-endedness that Eliot advocates when we try to make sense of the country's 2021 military coup? I'll offer two observations. So first, Eliot argues in the book that the problem of narrowly focusing on moments of direct contestation against authority is that doing so, quote, elides the longer-term strategies of refusal that makes resistance possible. So we therefore need to extend the historical scope of our interpretation beyond the temporal confines of a given moment of resistance. We need to interpret events in relation to the subsequent unfolding of history, but we also need to understand particular events in relation to what occurred before, which create the conditions of possibility for these specific events in the present. And that's, of course, as Eliot mentioned, why his book it remains so relevant in the post-coup situation, despite the radical change in conditions. Along these lines, Eliot makes the important point that the anti-coup uprising that began in 2021, quote, it did not emerge spontaneously. Instead, he writes, its seeds were sown in refusal of the military dictatorship that ruled from 1962 to 2011, and the uprising drew direct inspiration from the intense days of the transition, which one of his interlocutors referred to as, quote, the time of protests. So this insight is significant because even seemingly failed protests, strikes, or other struggles during the transition, along with the committed organizing of peasants, students, workers, and activists such as we read about in Eliot's book. All of this during the so-called transition helped build the social infrastructure that served after the coup as a basis for the nationwide uprising. Now, in support of this argument, which is also in support of the claim that the book remains very relevant with the changing circumstances after the coup, I'll quote a Burmese labor activist, as well as a friend of ours, who wrote in an article in December 2021, the author is Komang. He wrote, quote, had workers not previously organized unions inside their factories, the protests that catalyzed the Spring Revolution would not have happened. The February 6th protests ignited the anger of people across the country and led to nationwide protests in the days that followed. Now, perhaps Komang was, giving central importance to workers here, but I think Eliot's book makes the case for a wider understanding of this, that it's not the workers' role in the February 6th protest was particularly important, but the struggles across the country in the 10 years leading up to the coup, all of that combined to establish the sort of social infrastructure that ended up being the bedrock for the post-coup uprising. So a further point of note here is that towards the end of Rights Refused, Eliot asserts that, quote, the coup is revealed as a potentially revolutionary moment that opens new opportunities for political action. So in other words, in a very beautifully dialectical turn of events, the military coup, as an event of devastation and violent closure, has become the opposite, or become its opposite, a moment of radical emancipatory openness, pregnant with the possibility of transcending the liberal subterfuge that was sold to the people of Myanmar during the so-called democratic transition, but which remained throughout that period a restrictive elite electoral compromise. So the so-called democratic transition offered to the people of Myanmar superficial self-rule in the form of quasi-civilian electoral politics under oligarchic property relations. So by upending this inter-elite liberal political compromise that was misleadingly called a transition, the coup has opened space for a more radical demand. And as Eliot quotes on page 166 of Right's Refusal, the revolution now demands all power to the people. So by undoing the transition's elite compromise, the military junta has unwittingly served not only as its own gravedigger, but also as the historical midwife to the radically emancipatory transformation of Myanmar society, and the revolution must succeed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I'm conscious of the time that we need to leave for questions and answers, so I'll just keep my comments very, very brief and short. Just to complement Stephen's very, detailed, insightful discussion of why Eliot's analyses and research findings in the book are important, I'd just like to share how I think each of the book's chapters resonated with me as I was going through them. And I think, it's very much read with the coup and its aftermath in mind. So when I said earlier about Eliot's research helping us understand why the coup is how it is, and why responses to the coup are how they are, and why the situation is as it is close to 3 years after the coup, I think those are the kind of points that really hit me when I was going through each of the 6 chapters. For example, in the first chapter, which talks about variegated violence, there's this very interesting term that Eliot coins, blunt biopolitics. And there he explains what does it mean, blunt biopolitics. And of course, among those explanations, the point about the authorities in Burma, in Myanmar, governing through violence and ignoring the everyday occurrences of death, of despair, and the responsibility of the ordinary people, if you will. That's very important, because this is how I think the attitude towards governing probably has been ingrained across centuries, across decades, definitely, if we're looking at the post-independence era. And the other point about the blunt biopolitics, a definition that Eliot gives in chapter 1 really is, again, authorities in the country do not care about individual rights. So they don't care about the person in that sense. And I think Eliot has this description that he calls unexalted life. And there was this one explanation that was very striking, even though Aung San Suu Kyi, when she was talking about the victims of the jade mine collapse in Pagan in Kachin state, she was referring to those victims as, oh, they're illegal scavengers, therefore probably lessening the motivation by the authorities to really look into something so egregious, which relates to resource extraction and again, of course, human rights, the rights of whether illegal or not miners seeking to eke their existence. And the third characteristic of this blunt biopolitics term that struck me so much in chapter 1 really was the authorities in the country also do not seek to know the population groups. I mean, Eliot mentioned this in his presentation about, yes, there are administrative forms, there are ID cards, there are these categorizations of the national races, but they don't really seek to know. So there's this desultory knowledge and practice, going through the motions, if you will, this disinterest. And I think that's very important because, when we talk about dealing with the state in Myanmar, this is the kind of attitude that the people have. And then we, of course, can't also extrapolate or apply that, these people will actually automatically understand or respond to what interlocutors, external interlocutors particularly, are talking about: rights, obligations, compliance, if you will. So I think that was what really struck me for chapter 1. Chapter 2 really is about, refusal, the lives of refusal. And I think it's very interesting how Eliot there has really gone deep into defining and differentiating what is resistance and what is refusal. It's been explained, but I think what's very striking there is how that's actually practiced by these activists. The society at large is who has experienced violence at the hands of the authorities, they refuse to sign the pledge. They refuse to somehow become participants or be complicit in this illusion or image of everything's fine and there's law and order once people have been disciplined, kind of thing. So I think that was very, very important. But there was another part there about how resistance works below the radar. And this is where this very interesting notion of humanitarian assistance as a cover, as a fig leaf or whatever, or actually becoming the conduit through which a lot of, I think, activist activities or how people become activized could be carried out even in a very restrictive environment, and how people could get away with it. And I think that will also help link to how I think, we can understand the very well-meaning external interventions with trying to drive a humanitarian wedge into, I guess, intervening into Myanmar after the coup and the consequences of that. So I think people thinking about responses externally, internally, really need to look at the kind of, I think, the different strands and streams of consciousness and the empressement that people have with these concepts, how they interpret it. It's really important, as Eliot has highlighted in chapter 2. I think chapter 3 and 4 are more descriptive about the types of protests. Stephen has covered, the curse and the cartoons and so on. So I think, again, the final chapters about taking rights seriously and rights in desperation also points to that slipperiness, the ambiguity of the words when we translate them into Burmese, the connotations, and then how people, different communities, different interlocutors can try to maybe navigate their way to their own advantage because of that slippery nature of how rights is understood and interpreted, and therefore something that is very different from maybe how external interlocutors might view rights. And of course, added on top of that, what Eliot has highlighted, the two cultures of right, how the elite have engaged it, how they perceive it, or how they've kind of like really adopted the language of rights in engaging with the international, engaging with other partners, but paying lip service to it probably, and how the non-elite actually engage with it. And in chapter 5, Eliot explains the experience he had in looking at communities in Mae Sot in Thailand and in Yangon, the communities of practice. So I think that's the really the kind of really important takeaways I have. And the point about rights in desperation, it should not be emphasized. It must be emphasized. It cannot be emphasized enough, because the Rohingya ethnic cleansing really, I think, also highlights how the Rohingya communities have become the targets of this blunt biopolitics that Eliot started off with in chapter 1, and how really it's linked to resources, and also what Eliot highlights as rights, whether they are actually a bridging or a dividing mechanism, or whether they are inclusive or exclusionary in that sense. And that's really important. I think as a Burmese, when I was reading it, of course, I was also reading it with, bearing in mind the different terms that are the Burmese terms that are in the book. Eliot talks about boo, the word boo, which is just say no, and how that's been so much of the Burmese lexicon and vocabulary. And so when you actually have that as a response, as a reaction, that's the automatic refusal to have, refusing authority, refusing to do something. And that is an important term to remember, this notion of boo, of refusing. What does it mean for the people, the subalterns, the subjects, who also have had their rights they didn't know they have, refused? And at the same time, how the state also employs this boo, this refusing of rights. So it's both denying and rejecting. And I think there is that circular thing going on. Still, those are the dynamics in Myanmar today that I think we need to pay attention to when we're looking at, why certain, I think, overtures, offers, and interventions seem to be met with skepticism, with refusal, and with anger and frustration. And of course, the last point, going back to rights, is this Burmese word, akwin aye, which Eliot has explained the different dimensions and the combinations of the cognates. Eliot, I'd just like to add the point about, you talked about akwin aye being opportunity. So it's something being allowed. Kwin actually means allowing something, permitting something. But you see, that word about aye is also important, because akwin and aye, I mean, sometimes we think that that second part of akwin aye that describes rights is something that's there for, the word to sound better. But actually, aye also has importance because it means important. So it's an permission or opportunity as being important. And when I was in high school, I was very much interested in Burmese. It was one of the things. So the term now is a bit archaic. I don't think it's used that much in modern usage. But when we demand something, when we ask for something, I think the word people use now in informal language or whatever is dangsok, which is asking or requesting. But actually, the more archaic, well, I shouldn't say archaic, but the older form, maybe in the 1950s or earlier, is a yeso. So when you ask for something, when you say not dangsok, which is asking, almost begging, but a yeso is you're demanding it for something that's important. And I think that's something that I'd like to leave you, the audience, with in what, further inspired me in reading your book. So I apologize for taking time away from the question and answer and Eliot's responses before we open the floor for question and answer. But over to you, Eliot, for your responses.
Thank you very much. I in lieu of responding, because I've already spoken so much and you've been so kind to sit here for so long, what I if that's okay with the chair, give people a chance to ask the questions. And I think we should take as many questions as there are, so that we don't get caught up in like one question and then I answer, but rather get all the thoughts out there. And maybe I won't have a chance to, on the panel, won't have a chance to address all of them, but at least we reward you for sitting through that.
Okay, so maybe then I could ask for the first round of questions. I like to take 2 to 3. So I see the lady in the 4th row raising her hand. Any other hands on this part of the room? Okay, the gentleman in the back row. So I've got 2 questions. And the lady in the 2nd row there. So we've got 3 questions from the in-person participants, and we'll check questions from our online participants later on. But yeah, perhaps we could get all the questions first. Ma'am, you had your hand first.
Hi, I'm Jen. Congratulations. I think it's really enjoyable. And my question is, I'm so curious to know, like, what are the moral traditional, like, behind of this demanding or asking if it's not so I'm like, so they are refusing the liberal rights, but they definitely have a way to frame, I mean, their this kind of whatever you call it, either rights or what is justified or justice. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Elliot. As a chemist, this was you provide a very nice lecture. And even though I began reading the book, it was very good introduction to actually your title about rights refused. So in relation to that, if the Burmese themselves don't seem to want or accept this notion of rights, can we extend that to Aung San Suu Kyi? And in a sense, does your book absolve her of responsibility for condoning the genocide of the Rohingya? This was one of my questions. And then the second question, you can dismiss if this is widely known in the field, but in the West, this rights, I don't know exactly where it arose. So would you say that the situation that you observe, like that you describe about dialectical and whatever terms, is a developmental stage, that is something that, you know, Myanmar can grow out of? Or is it a bifurcation and it's a different developmental path that we should not just put the template that we have witnessed in the nominal West onto them. Thank you.
Yeah, congratulations, as everyone's been saying, on your book. I'm from Canada. I'm an international exchange student. I study in international political science, but I'm also a certified victimologist in forensics as well, in a lot of different communities. And based on what I'm hearing about the book, what I've read online, my question is that a lot of the times when we speak about Indigenous communities or Ukrainians fighting for their rights, those kinds of things, you want to ask the individuals who are at the forefront, and you had the opportunity to be there. What can the international community do to serve the question? Like, what is the community asking for? What are the activists asking for? And how is it that international groups like Human Rights Watch groups that operate in and around that have been there, what can they do? What do they want? And how can that be supported? Thank you.
Great questions. Thank you. So the first one about, well, if they're not asking for rights, what idioms are they using? I didn't have a chance to get to some of that because of limitations of time, but I answer it in two ways. One, the sort of mode of appeal that a right is structured through is deontic, which is a fancy word for saying like focus on a duty. You must do this. You must give this to me. And I find that that is often not the way that things are framed in Burmese, because it presupposes a relationship that you can't perform into being. You can't demand if you're the one, even there's a sort of performative contradiction of asking for a right, because if you, or demanding it, because if you don't have it, there's a reason why you don't have it. You're not strong enough to have it. There's a, you've been denied it already. So what are you doing demanding it? So as opposed to deontic modality, I see a lot of claims made through what is sometimes called epistemic modality. Wouldn't it be good if you were the kind of leader who did things this way? And so they often frame their interventions as such. The other watchword is dawon, which is the Burmese word for duty, oddly enough, but it's more like taking responsibility. So they'll often, along those lines, say, look at the people who are supposed to be taking responsibility for these things, and they're not doing it. Now, often, if we're, look closely, they never claim to be taking responsibility in the first place. So this is a performative that works versus a performative, the rights one, that doesn't quite work, I think. Now, that might get a little bit, you might say, well, you're contradicting yourself, but in the realm of politics, sometimes you have to pay like the hard and fast distinctions aren't always there. And one thing I do want to say is that it's not that Burmese people will never, claim their rights, as it were. These are more patterns that I observed over a long time. And based on like class division, especially. So in terms of Aung San Suu Kyi, I want to be clear that by saying that there are no rights, this doesn't mean there is no justice. Rights is a particular political technology that regulates the relationship between those who supposedly have the power and those who don't through a certain contractual obligation. Like you get security, you give up some of your freedom. In exchange, rights mediates that relationship, but it's a particular one rather than, there's lots of different ones that could be imagined. And as a result, like Aung San Suu Kyi did really terrible things by not just sins of omission, where she didn't say enough about the Rohingya, but she said lots of terrible things about them. She claimed that they were making up fake rape, as she put it on her Facebook page, or that humanitarian workers were only helping the Rohingya and not the Rakhine. She said, how could the military ever be thought to have done something excessive when they killed 12,000 people and drove 800,000 people out of the country? So the claims of justice are still very there and work through idioms as I just described. So not having rights doesn't, it's just one particular technology that might work depending on the context. And that gets into your second question, which is about sort of developmental stages. I think that rights are tied up with the Western European bourgeois revolutions, in which the sort of emancipation of the bourgeoisie from the previous, feudalism tended to congeal under a form of property regime that imagined rights almost as a property, the same kind of inalienable possession that I described earlier. But that's not the only way it can be done. And as a result, like one of the fun things about anthropology, if I can, endorse it for a second, is you get to kind of not take things as necessarily universal, except for, this is a nod to Stephen, capital is universal. Besides that, and capitalism is universal, but other things than that, you don't have to do them the same way. And it can be really interesting to explore the alternatives. The final question about international communities is a really great one. And I'm kind of two minds. I think most people are of two minds. On one hand, they're very confused why, I'm wearing a Palestine shirt right now, why everyone in America needs to care about this one conflict and doesn't care at all about their own. And they would appreciate more recognition. But on the other hand, it's hard to ignore the sort of blithe endorsement that the U.S. in particular had of the sort of the structures and the actors that led to some of these contradictions that then produced the coup on one hand. On the second, if you're constantly waiting for help from the outside, it's hard to organize a strategy from the inside. And so I see some actors saying, okay, we gave the chance for the West to help us. They chose Ukraine. They chose to ignore us. That puts other options on the table. Whereas in the first couple of months, people were essentially being told sometimes by external pundits that you need to not be violent because you need to demonstrate that you are worthy of the salvation from the West. And after a certain point, as more and more people died, they basically said, the extra corpse isn't going to make a difference. And I think that helped cohere an armed response, which it's not my place to endorse armed violence versus not, but as an observer, you can see how that ended up becoming a lot more successful than just being slaughtered. And so even this Operation 1027, we know how it'll play out, but the things seem as hopeful. Everyone has to be very careful when thinking about hope in the Burmese context, but things seem as hopeful as they ever had. And one wonders, would that have been possible if people had remained dependent on external salvation?
Second round of questions or comments. I see one hand in the second round and one hand in the. You got two different.
Good evening, professors. Just curious. So it's been about 3 months since the beginning of Operation 1027. So since Operation 1027 is conducted by majority part by ethnic armed organizations from Burma, from Myanmar's multiple ethnic minorities, do you see a role that these groups could take in changing the dynamics of, I guess, power and rights that you have stated earlier?
Great question.
Thanks for that. My question might or might not make sense, but it comes out of the, so as the presentation was going, one word that I was expecting that did not come up was responsibility. And I think in the book, which is an amazing book, which I've started but haven't finished yet, unfortunately, as far as I can tell, the word responsibility and the word duty don't come up. And they've come up a couple of times in the discussion already. So I'm wondering about, and I'm also thinking in resistance studies in relation to the Arab world and Islamic studies, there's a big discussion theoretically about the difference between rights and responsibilities as a performative or as sort of a way of laying claim that has to do with, you don't lay claim by asserting a right, you lay claim by asserting someone's responsibility to do something vis-a-vis you. And that has to do with a different ontotheology of the subject in which the entire ego kind of falls apart, the master subject falls apart, there's a relationality, and that relationality has to do with giving, not taking, or asserting social duties and reciprocities instead of rights that are in a liberal, self-contained master subject. So I'm wondering how, if you can say a bit more about responsibilities here, which you've mentioned, but also if we want to think of an alternative conception of the subject that is, underlying all of this absence. Yeah, can you say a bit more about that? Thank you.
Just a very quick question about how you think the social figure of the activist has changed in the 3 years since the coup.
Okay, so the first question about Operation 1027, the little bit of context that it's led by these 3 ethnic armed organizations that have never really participated together, and they're certainly not connected very historically with the Burma, the main majority group that I was spending most of my time with. But what's kind of interesting is that most of the Burma revolution has been fought by different kinds of people than in the past as well, particularly like what are called Anya, like Anyatu and Anyata, uplanders. And that doesn't mean, sorry, upper Burma people, like upriver people, sorry, not uplanders. That's totally wrong. But the people who exist in Sagaing, Mandalay, and Magway. And the reason why I bring this up is that I think both of these different entities are fighting for something similar, but that's not connection with one another. They are kind of articulating an almost like anarchist tradition that is challenging the very presuppositions of the nation state. And some colleagues had an article in Irrawaddy a couple of days ago where they argued that the mandala, which is the sort of classic concentric circle of diffusing power over space rather than homogeneous control, and as a result, different suzerainities, I think is the word that is often used, play off one another to create zones of autonomy, should actually be something we take seriously as a sort of like really intense version of federalism. And so when you say, are they imagining something different? They really are, and it's an exciting time in that regard. And this is one of the things that while the coup is very it's a catastrophe at a world historic level in many ways, and given how many people have died, that does have that sort of silver lining. But every time I talk to my activist friends, which I still do quite often, they'll tell me no matter what good can come from the coup, it wasn't worth it, which I think is kind of interesting, because the sort of amount of horror that what people have had to live through since the coup isn't, even if you get to the sort of liberated space that they imagine, they say, or at least my closest friend still says it wasn't worth it, which I think is worthy of kind of recalling as we think about dialectics. So the responsibility duty, keep reading, there's a lot of responsibility and duty at the end as this alternative modality. But what I think what is special about responsibility is that it's not a responsibility necessarily placed in the state, right? And that's usually where we imagine a right kind of emerging from. Usually the activists use responsibility as this idiom that kind of creates a new set of relations in which they say, who is taking responsibility for this? And then they look around and realize that no one is. And then they say, we will take responsibility for it. And then they encourage people who have always been kind of left to their own devices to articulate a more active version of citizenship, which gets a little bit close to maybe the sort of obnoxious resilience discourse. And I don't want to endorse that, but in a situation where no one has ever presupposed that the state's going to come to your aid, people have to construct these alternative versions of the sort of like a colleague named Gerard McCarthy calls Gotu Gota. It doesn't call it that, but identifies Gotu Gota, which is a Burmese expression for kind of like looking out for yourself, supporting oneself. Now, this issue of absence, or sorry, this issue of what kind of subject you're talking about reminds me of a sort of interesting hole at the center of the book, in the sense that you have these actors who are refusing the sort of despotism of the state on one hand, and they're also refusing like the sort of liberal presuppositions about the way subjects should act on the other. And so it's almost like there's an activist emptiness that I'm trying to tease out. And I haven't, the weird thing about writing a book is that you think you've stuffed everything in there, and then it keeps like baking. You take something out of the oven and it's still hot and it's still baking. And so this period has allowed me to kind of think more about what kind of subjectivity is this activist subjectivity in Burma and beyond, and this sort of radical openness, because you don't really know what you're going to create. You don't know what's going to come next. And that doesn't mean there are like all these horizontal connections they have with their people they're in solidarity with, and that are motivated by real versions of justice that of course do constitute themselves as subjects, but there is a sort of deferral of these other aspects of what they'll mean. So Stephen spends a lot of time looking at the Myanmar radical tradition, the communist tradition. And I'm always a little bit skeptical, because every time I talk, sorry, Stephen, every time I talk to the interlocutors, they're kind of like, yeah, but we can't be communist because of the dictatorship of the proletariat we cannot accept. And farmers hate communists because they purged a bunch of people during the 70s, which is true, unfortunately, following 60s, following the Stalin. And they're against religion, and we're really for religion. So they have this sort of like almost Maoist politics in which they're kind of like wedded to the people they're working with, and they're always kind of like proleptically ready to think again about what their politics should be, which I think is pretty cool. We can also learn a lot from. Finally, Andrew asks, has the figure of the activists changed with the coup? Well, there's a lot of these activists I work with, they call themselves like grassroots activists, and they called the other people who, and I don't have a monopoly on this term activism, but they had called these other folks yebosi, which is this wonderful Burmese term, which means oil on top of the water. Like the oil, it doesn't mix, it chooses to be on top and to not, be in solidarity with everyone else. And so they were constantly fighting against these yebosi, and they kind of see themselves as being like history has looked at their particular perspective quite well, and there isn't as much space for the sort of third force folks who wanted to give a sense like upper class capitalist collusion a chance, basically. And I'm pretty sympathetic to that, because after being stuck in a pretty miserable situation for a really long time, the transition, I think, and I might be deemed an enemy of the revolution for saying this, I do think it was worth taking a chance on. And I think even the activists that I worked with would say so, even though they condemned it, they still at least wanted to see where it would go. And now, of course, because of the coup, there isn't much space for those particular kinds of activists. And they would say, because fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. And that's why I think those of you working in this space of trying to get towards a peace will have a very hard time dealing with people who say there's no credible way that the military can ever commit to peace, because they've already screwed it up so deeply. So being an activist has to be a radical one. There is no space for a liberal activist anymore. I don't know if that's true, but logically, I think it makes sense.
We've kind of eaten a bit into the book signing and more in-depth conversation with the author. So if there are any burning questions that people have, comments that people have for the plenary discussion, now's your chance. Going once, the lady in the front row. Going twice, the lady in the third row. Okay, so 2 last takers, and then after that, there's also one at the back. I apologize if I didn't. Okay, we have 3 last takers. Ma'am, over to you.
I do have one, but I think it's meant as a closing one, actually. Very many congratulations. Thank you for giving us a wonderful book that we're all looking forward to reading. What would you most like to see happen with this book now that it has a life of its own that you can't quite totally control, but how would you like to see it read? How would you like to see it taught in classes? Where would you like to see it go?
Thank you, Professor. Congratulations. And my question is a little bit based on my own experience, and I'm a graduate student in Chinese culture and language studies, and I'm from Yunnan, the southwest part of China, and the province like very close to the border with Myanmar. So my question is, how could the activists and also the activities happened within Myanmar? How they can balance and facing when the foreign force like China that potentially support behind, because I heard some informations about the warfare happened in the north of Myanmar, the Laogai area. So some of my relatives and friends, they actually suffering and have the news about like how China supported behind. So I would like to listen some like your opinions. Thank you.
Yeah, great. So I'll take that question first and then finish with Jennifer. So I was recently, well, not so recently, maybe 4 months ago on the border, the Thai-Burma border, and I had kind of like was wondering why hasn't the oil pipeline that crisscrosses from Rakhine State in the west, where the Rohingya are, all the way to Yunnan, why haven't they blown that thing up yet? I was asking this merely as an intellectual question, of course. And they told me, and my colleagues told me, people who were like drone operators. So like in the sort of thick of it, they said, well, because don't you know, China is our friend. And they said it tongue in cheek because that hasn't been the case in the past. But they said, where do you think we get, the guns that we have? Like China is permitting those sort of sales that are occurring. And I don't think I'm saying anything that people don't know by saying that. And I think because China is playing sort of both sides, they don't know that if the military is going to be successful, they want to keep the revolution on side. And as a result, the sort of deck isn't as stacked against the revolutionary actors as it has been in the past. Like certainly Russia is still selling and Israel is still selling Myanmar weapons and Myanmar military weapons, but because they have their own genocidal wars going on, I shouldn't have laughed, that they're actually using up their own weapons, so they have fewer to sell. And so as a result, in terms of the broader political economy of weapons and warfare, is not as bad as it could be. But it is very complicated, as you allude to, with all these different actors, including these essentially like situations of enslavement where people have been brought to run like internet scams that it makes China very upset, and they want that cleared out. So they're quite happy to have those 1027 EAOs working towards those goals. So I don't pretend to understand all these dynamics, but it's less bleak than initially I thought. Then the final question, thank you for, yeah, okay.
Oh, sorry for delaying everything. I was going to throw it back at you, Elliot. Thank you. There's a critique of the human rights discourse. What does that mean for a Western human rights discourse? Which is where I think you were going with your. So, thanks.
Great. So I'll take that one up. So this idea that the rights are inalienable possessions means that they're kind of attached to us as people. And so there's a sort of inflationary aspect in which we keep getting more and more of these rights that we didn't have before, at least discursively described. Like suddenly things that we didn't have rights to before are described as such. But then in terms of the political economy of late capitalism, we're seeing fewer and fewer people actually able to realize those rights. And I think this creates a particular kind of like ennui and sort of existential angst when you are essentially split as a subject between this like rights-bearing subject who has all these things that you've been declared to have discursively, but your material reality is not able to realize them. You kind of wait to be restored to the version of yourself that you're supposed to be. And I think that's a particularly demobilizing kind of politics, because you end up like writing a Facebook post about how you didn't get your rights, and well, yeah, you didn't get your rights. What's next? For Burmese people, this can be demobilizing too. People don't have rights to rely on, so they have to think twice before they make demands or conjure up new ways of doing things. But it can be mobilizing in the sense that they are not stuck waiting to be restored to a status that they know they didn't have in the first place. So they're always kind of trying to improvise new sorts of things. So thanks for giving me a chance to do that little spiel. And finally, I'm in the process of getting the book translated by a dear friend of mine and NUS history PhD, Pyo Lat, and I hope that it can be read in Myanmar. And one of the cool things about Pyo Lat is that he understands that trying to come up with like a literal Burmese translation for biopolitics would not get you very far. So he's working through the local vernacular to try to come up with a new conceptual vocabulary that can define things as they are on the ground. Now, that's one sort of goal. The other one is I would love to have it be in conversation with some of the other kind of ethnographic texts that try to adduce from the way people are living their lives, kind of like political philosophical perspectives. But we'll see if that actually happens. Thanks.
On that note, thank you for the patience for our online attendees, as well as the rest of you, ladies and gentlemen, in this room. We've gone a bit over time, but I always feel it's important to get as much into understanding what Elliot wants to tell us, share with us through his research. And there are about, I think, in the past, there were about 3 books that I would always recommend for reading for people who really want to understand Myanmar in formulating responses or interventions. Making Enemies by Mary Callahan, Living in Silence by Christina Fink, Recently, this co-authored book by 3 political scientists, Jacques Bertrand, Alexandre Pelletier, and Aref Balmon, on winning by process, which really looks at how the state, the Myanmar state, has tried to win the whole ethnic, ceasefire process by dragging out the process. And the 4th book that I will recommend for people who want to understand how engaging, Myanmar in all its, different aspects and interlocutors going forward in the post-2021 situation is Eliot Prosser-Freeman's Rights Refused. With that, thank you very much, and please give a big round of applause to Dr. Eliot Prosser-Freeman.
There's food. We're going to feed you, so please.
Thank you very much to our online attendees.